I'd like to quickly introduce myself. I'm Paul Lim. I'm an assistant managing editor at Money Magazine. I'm in charge of the magazine's investing coverage. And we brought a couple of our younger staffers with us from New York to kind of talk about the state of millennial finances. To the far right is Taylor Tepper. Taylor is a staff writer at Money, and in that capacity writes about a lot of different topics, but investing, credit cards, and the exorbitant cost of being a young dad are probably the three main ones. Taylor's work has appeared in a variety of publications besides Money, including Bloomberg and the Tampa Bay Times. Taylor is a graduate of CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism, and he also has a degree from NYU. In the middle is Kerri Renzulli. Kerri is, hello? Hello? Oh. Kerri is a staff reporter at Money, and she also covers a variety of topics for us. Her main areas of interest include family finances, workplace issues, and she also covers taxes. I don't think that's a main interest. I don't think anybody's really interested in that. Kerri her work has appeared in a variety of... Kerri Ann's work has appeared also in a variety of other publications, including the Orlando Sentinel and the Orlando Business Journal. She's a graduate of Columbia's Journalism School, as well as the University of Central Florida. So we are, there you go.
There are a few of us, yes.
So we're here to talk about kind of the state of millennial finances. And I just want to note that people of my generation, and I'm a Gen Xer, I didn't realize I had to mention that, but I'm a Gen Xer. People of my generation love writing about millennials for a couple reasons. One, your generation is is overtaking the boomers as the single most important economic generation for this country. In terms of purchasing power, I think millennials account for almost a third of total consumer spending right now in the US. And obviously consumer spending is the biggest portion of this economic engine. But there's another reason why millennials are important economically, and that's kind of the timing of where you are in your life cycle. That there are economists who will note that when generations hit the 30 and especially the 35-year-old mark, that is kind of an essential period. There's kind of a ratio that economists point out, which is called the MY ratio. It stands for middle-aged to young workers. And when a market hits a point where the number of middle-aged workers, which are those who are early 30s to late 40s, when the numbers of that group grow relative to younger workers, that's generally a great time for the economy and a great time for the stock market. Well, technically, you guys are now or at least the upper wave of your generation is hitting 30 and the early 30s, so you are now approaching middle-aged, according to economists. So congratulations.
You feeling that?
The other reason why people my age like to write about people your age is that, generally speaking, if we put millennials in a post, it gets clicks. So generally speaking, a business publication will write, millennials act this, in such and such way with regard to their personal finances, it'll get a bunch of clicks. The next day we'll write, you know what, on second thought, millennials act the opposite way with regard to their finances, and it too will get clicks. The problem with that kind of theory is that embedded in a lot of these stories is advice. I mean, our magazine is about giving personal finance advice to folks based on economic and market trends. And if there's no understanding of how a particular group of consumers or investors or savers actually behaves, it's hard to give proper advice as to what they should be doing with their money at a particular stage of life. So, we're here to talk about some of what's out there, some of the myths that are floating out there, and one of the biggest myths out there, and I think this is something that Gen Xers often kind of make fun of millennials about, is the fact that you guys won't refuse to leave home, right? That there is this notion that millennials don't want to grow up. And you could look at any number of statistics about You're getting married later than my generation or the boomers. You're having kids later, with the exception of Taylor. You're living with your parents longer. You're not forming households in with nearly the same speed that young Gen Xers did at this stage of our lives. So that's obviously a concern both for your personal finances, but also the economy. But Taylor, is it the case that we're in a situation where millennials are acting this way irrationally?
No, it's perfectly rational, and I think millennials are people too. We're not snakes, we're not aliens, we're human beings with rational thoughts. And it's true that millennials are putting off marriage and they're putting off kids, but they're not abandoning it. It's not as if this is something that you see in the data that millennials are just not doing. It's just happening a little bit later. There's a lot of reasons for that. And then stepping back a little bit, this is a huge cultural shift. It's been going on for a long time. Fewer boomers were married at this point than their parents, fewer Gen X than boomers, and fewer us than Gen X. So this is a long developing trend. Pew has a lot of great data on that. So also, our generation is, you hear this all the time, we are the most well-educated generation of all time. We go to school. Give yourself a round of applause. Well done. We go to school, we go to grad school, and by going to grad school, you are delaying your entrance into the workforce. That means you're starting your jobs a little bit later, which means you're starting to think about starting families a little bit later. So basically, from here on out, if you listen to demographic researchers, older millennials, people who sort of maybe born in the mid-'80s or so, maybe a little bit later, or a little bit earlier, are going to start having kids, and they're going to start getting married a lot more over the next 10 years. Right now, about 60% of children born to millennials are born to married millennials. That's going to be about 77% in a decade. And basically, just remember that and when it comes to having kids, the overall birth rates are declining across the world. This isn't a millennial-specific trend, and part of that is that there's just fewer unplanned pregnancies now. Especially, a new study just came out that over the past 7 years or so, there have been a lot fewer unplanned pregnancies. So it just means that family formation is being pushed out a bit. So that's the family aspect. And when it comes to homes, millennials still like homes. They still like houses. They're not opposed to homes and houses. They don't want to live with their parents forever. So it is true that millennial housing development has sort of gone down compared to other generations. But it's not necessarily because they can't afford it or they don't want it. It's just because it provides more flexibility. It provides it's more affordable than getting a mortgage at this point. And also they're preparing to own homes, which feeds back into the fact they're starting their careers a little bit later because of so much education. Only 8% or so are renting because they can't afford a mortgage and they want a mortgage. And basically, another aspect to understand about housing is that we just went through the worst housing crisis of all time. Older millennials graduated into that terrible housing crisis. I graduated in May of 2008, as the housing market went boom. 4 months later, the stock market went boom. This unprecedented student loan debt, that means there's a lot of upfront costs that millennials have to deal with that older generations didn't. So basically, housing is coming back, home starts are coming back, but if you look at it, home starts are sort of coming up here, and before the recession, it was up here. So it's just going to take a lot of time to sort of get back over that terrible explosion that happened in the middle of the last decade.
Is there something that you think that millennials ought to be doing in their best interest when it comes to household, going out, starting families, thinking about at least taking the first steps to investigate that house?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's a scary prospect, the idea of starting a family, of buying a home, of establishing those roots. Especially when you want to have flexibility, when you don't necessarily want to live in one particular place for a long time, when you want to work in one job for a very long time, or you still want to be nimble. But there are a lot of advantages to it. I sort of came to these advantages accidentally, but they're wonderful nonetheless. So the good thing about starting a family early is that a lot of your costs happen now while you're still sort of young and starting out in your career. That means by the time your kids go off to college and the expenses that you have to pay for them, the $20,000 a year you have to pay for them, and all kinds of costs, those costs are going down, and you have hit your earnings peak, your mid-40s up until like your mid-50s, or a time where you're going to be generating the most amount of income of your entire life. That means if you've fallen behind a little bit on your savings, on your retirement goals, you can ramp up. You can power save, as we like to say. So this provides a great freeing of an expense at the same time you're hitting your peak earnings period, so you can really patch up your 401ks and your emergency funds and the rest of your savings goals. Another good idea of having kids, another good reason to have having kids now is because you're not, the boss. You are an employee. You don't have to put in as much face time generally. This is a case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, you don't have to put in as much face time for meetings. You're not inundated with 17 project meetings during this period. You have a little bit more flexibility. So that means that if you need to take time to go to a PTA meeting or to go to the dentist or to do anything with your kids, you can do it. And basically, having kids a little bit later has its own cost with it. Having kids in your mid to late 30s brings on a panoply of health and economic considerations that are not always the best. When it comes to mortgages, you don't really have to pay off, it's usually you want to put 20% down. You don't have to put 20% down on a mortgage. There's guaranteed loans from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac where you put down 3%, FHA loans are 3.5%. Closing costs are about 3% of the price, so it's not insurmountable. And when it comes to sort of the debt load you can handle, consider like the 28-36 rule, which is basically housing represents no more than 28% of your pre-tax income, and all of your other combined debts are no more than 38%. When you're thinking about this negotiations of when it's time to rent or when it's time to buy, use a rent-buy calculator. So these are great. You can find one on Trulia, which is one that we recommend. It will let you sort of know when it's time for you to think about buying a house as opposed to renting. So you can take advantage of the mortgage interest deduction. And a general rule of thumb is you want to have about 2%, you want to have a ratio of 2 to 1 when it comes to mortgage to income. So if you make, if you and your wife or you and your husband or you and your partner are making about $100,000 a year, look for about $200,000 in a mortgage. And then when it comes to saving, so there's no unfortunately, there's no golden ticket. There's no magic answer to it. A lot of the good advice, I think Kerri will hit more, but automate savings, putting away $100 a month, kick up your savings rate when an expense goes away, pay off, or when you pay off a big expense. So if you've paid off, when that day comes when you pay off your student loans, put that monthly payment you're making to the government, to your private borrower, to a fund that's dedicated towards housing. There's a lot of apps that let you do this. One good one is Simple Banking. There's no fees. You can track sort of all of your goals in different buckets, and you can see how you are, and that will let you know how much available spending you have to do something like go to the movies.
So jumping off the savings point, let's go to the second myth.
Yeah.
There is this notion out there that millennials, like all young people, I guess, of any generation, are good at spending and not so much at saving. And in headlines you can find references to the fact that millennials end up spending about $9 out of $10 of their earnings in totality. That they're willing to spend more on things like clothing than other generations are. They're spending more. They're willing to spend on premium items, whether it's organic foods or things that are tied to socially responsible things. So that's kind of like the background of why you'll read in the popular media that there is this concern about millennial finances. Kerri Ann, what is the reality with regard to the saving and spending patterns of
So
of
they're
this
not
group?
so much the spendthrifts or, $7 latte drinking people that I know parents sometimes make us out to be, or other people. But millennials are actually doing a really good job in starting to save for retirement. A lot of us are skeptical that we will have Social Security there for us when we reach that age. The whole idea of a defined benefit pension plan is something that most of us have never heard of, but like our parents and grandparents probably had. And so I feel like we have internalized a lot of assumptions that we're going to have to be very self-reliant. We have seen that things might not pan out for us the way that they did for our parents or older generations. And that's why millennials are saving actually 8% of their paychecks for retirement. And boomers are only at 9%, and granted, their paychecks are probably a bit more, so on a dollar amount, that's probably a bit more, but still, to be only 1% behind when we are so young, just starting out in our careers, we have student loans, all kinds of things really weighing on us. So we are saving. And one of the reasons that our generation has been so good, I think, and so able to start this early is that we are automatically enrolled a lot in our 401ks. If you're at a workplace that does that, that's actually a good thing. That's the reason why our generation has actually started saving at 22, which is amazing when you think about compounding interest and how much we'll be able to take advantage of that. People in Gen X didn't start till 27, and boomers didn't really start till 35. So if you think about that, we're actually doing really great. But not a lot of people tend to focus on that because, like I said, on a dollar amount, it's probably still less than boomers are putting away. One area, though, that millennials struggle with, but basically everyone in America struggles with, is having an emergency fund, having 3 to 6 months of liquid cash available so that, if an unexpected car repair comes, if something like you lose your job happens, you have a cushion there. And more than half of millennials don't have this. But 62% of Americans are also in the same boat, so we're not alone in this not so great habit of not saving enough for a rainy day. And I think that part of the reason why we don't have as much money put away is that we're just starting in our careers. So I don't want to say, if you don't have 6 months, don't freak out and worry too much. There's time to kind of build that up. We're just getting stable in our jobs. We are still very young, but it is great if you guys can think about it, putting away maybe 1 month of living expenses, essential living expenses, things like rent, food, utilities, and then once you've got 1 month to kind of focus on 3 and then 6 rather than just focusing on 6, because that's really daunting. Trying to reach that goal myself, even with a stable job for 3 years, can sometimes be a little hard.
And to be fair, we should note that at this stage of your life, your expenses are going to be much, much lighter than for somebody who has kids or who's married, right? And we just want to emphasize that in terms of the emergency fund, you're looking at your actual, an equivalent of your actual expenses as opposed to your take-home pay.
Yes. The other thing that I wanted to point out that we're actually really good at is mainly probably because we have so little money and things are very tight, especially with the amount of debt that we tend to carry, is that we're actually better at tracking our expenses. We use things like Mint, things like Simple to keep track of. We're doing actually better than boomers, and we're a little bit better at sticking to a budget, which I think is quite a good thing. No one likes budgets. We're trying to stick to them. So a little pat on the back for us in that regard. But there are a lot of things that you guys could be doing to probably up the savings, lots of different strategies that you can take advantage of. One of the things that we wrote about recently was, if you have a 401k, you obviously want to try and get the match, contribute at least up to the match. And, even if you have other weighing matters like your rent and your student loan debt, you want to try and at least put up to the match. But we had a great piece about just start saving. Even if your asset allocation, you're not sure, should I be this much in bonds, should I be this much in stocks? We ran some figures and we found that even if you only got a 2% return for the first 10 years you had your 401k, and then you adjusted it and brought in 6% for the next 30 years, you would still have added 46% to your total 401k wealth by the time you're 65. So really, just getting in early and saving can be huge way down the line. Taylor kind of brought this up, but another way to easily start saving is to put away money that you aren't used to spending. So things like once you've paid off a debt, that amount of money you used to pay, you can put into savings. But also any extra money you come across. If you get a raise at your job, or you get your tax refund back and you've got a couple $100s there, instead of using it for maybe some fun, or maybe you can use a little for fun, but put most of it into either upping your 401k, or you can put it in another investment vehicle like a Roth IRA. Another thing that you can do is if you receive a raise, you can contribute, let's say you get a 3% raise. You can take that 3% and then put it in your 401k, and you're still living off what you were living last year, but you probably won't notice the difference because it's such a small amount, and you were living probably comfortably the year before on what you had.
And just as a caveat to that, I mean, we've been mindful of the fact that our readers of all ages have noted that just telling people to sacrifice is a tough sell when it comes to things like increasing your 401k. And we've started to kind of amend or shade that advice a little bit to say, look, if you think it's going to be a real burden to put all of that raise in, put half of that raise in to boost it, so that you at least feel like you're moving in the right direction. And if you realize that you can do better, that you're comfortable even with putting half of that raise in and you can get by, then maybe the next raise you'll put a slightly bigger percentage of it. So it's kind of a nice snowball effect. Taylor, let me turn to the other side of the ledger, because I mean, there is some hope with regard to how this group is saving and how this group is making decisions when it comes to budgeting and whatnot. What about that other side of the ledger in terms of credit? Because one of the myths out there is that the millennials are bad with credit, just like pretty much any generation of young people at this stage of their life, right? Any generation at this stage is considered a risk when it comes to credit. And there are actually some numbers that would say, well, maybe they are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So millennials have lower credit scores than Gen X. They use more of their available credit. Their credit utilization ratio is higher. Those are all bad things. But it's not surprising that we have worse credit. We make less money. We've started off with credit. We have a shorter amount of time with credit. A big portion of your credit score is how long you've had credit. And so by virtue of the functionality of a credit score, we will have worse credit. But if you look sort of in depth into the numbers a little bit, and you look at some survey data, millennials actually have some good habits that some of our older brethren could use. For instance, we carry lower balances than Gen X. We carry lower balances than boomers. We are much better at not having as much debt as those two generations do.
Well, we have higher credit limits.
Yes. You should always pay off your balance, Paul.
As in full every month.
You have more daycare to finance. Gen X also has more cards. I mean, the number of cards you have isn't necessarily a bad thing, but to carry off all of their terrible expenses, Gen X, like Paul, has to have all these credit cards and carry their balances, whereas millennials have fewer cards. So it's not exactly the case that millennials, the behavior of millennials is worse than the behavior of any other generation. Some of it's just sort of biased how the numbers are, and some of it shows that millennials are actually pretty good and pretty savvy at picking cards. We're much better at dealing with technology and sort of hacking which cards we should use and which cards we shouldn't use, how to find those cards than millennials, than older people are. And then when it comes to, so basically, when it comes to actually picking a card, when it comes to which card you want to use, millennials have a little trouble here. Millennials are more biased towards debit cards. Now, this is actually a very nuanced point, but it's an important point to make. So about 70% of millennials prefer to use a debit card than a credit card. That's not actually a good thing. It's actually, in if you are able to carry a balance, if you're able to carry a card without carrying a balance, it's actually a bad thing. Credit card spending is using a card to do any kind of spending is better than using a debit card. There are more protections if your card gets stolen. So that's one huge benefit of having a credit card. The other big benefit of using a credit card as opposed to a debit card is that you get rewards. You get cash back, you get miles. There are ways to leverage your spending, especially in this sort of low-rate environment where it's hard to get a good return on your bond investments. You can get 2% return on all of your spending with certain cards. That is a huge bonus. So in those ways, I think that those are sort of the troubles that millennials have. They think that credit cards are inherently bad, when in reality, it's actually a better form of spending than debit cards if you are able to pay off your balance every month. If you can't pay off your balance every month, then you should get a credit card just to build your credit history, because credit history is 15% of your FICO credit score. But put like one thing on it. Put your Blue Apron thing, put your Netflix account on it, pay it off every month, and don't spend it for anything else if you're unable to use a credit card without carrying a balance. But if you pay off your card every month, if you're responsible, which you should be, which isn't very difficult to be, then using credit card spending is much better for you than using your debit card.
Just to step back, in terms of what goes into the actual credit score,
Right.
I mean, the assumption is that obviously if you're using credit and you're maxing out your cards, that's a bad thing.
Yes,
but that's
bad.
only,
Don't max out your cards.
Yeah, but that's only like, maybe about a third
Right.
of what goes into the actual score. What are some of the other things that go into the score?
So some of the other things that go into it besides your spending is, like I said before, is your credit history. And that's why you want to keep your card as long as possible. You want to keep the first card you get, you want to keep it for a long time. And you want to show that to your borrowers that you are able to people you borrow from, that you are able to maintain a very long credit history. So that's like one easy thing to do. When you get your first card, don't close it. Keep it for a long time. There's really no reason to ever close it if it's a no-fee card, no annual fee card. And when you start adding credit cards to your sort of credit card portfolio, transfer more of your spending to those other cards that get you better rewards, but keep that card so that people who want to lend you money know that you are a viable lender.
And that's an important point, because it's kind of a conventional strategy. If anybody gets into trouble with regard to a credit card, the natural advice is once you pay it off,
Yeah.
slice it up.
Yeah, it's terrible
and
advice.
cancel the account. But
Bad advice.
But as long as you pay it down,
Yeah.
and keep it in your wallet or keep it in your drawer, really.
Yeah.
And don't think about it, that actually improves your credit score.
Yeah, absolutely it does. If you're able to do that, it keeps your credit score going very well. Another myth is that the more credit cards you have, the worse your credit score will be, where the opposite is kind of true. If you keep your spending the same and you pay off your balances every month, if you increase your number of credit cards, which means you're increasing your credit limit, and you're keeping your spending the same, then the amount of credit you're using each month goes down because your credit's going higher and your score is going the same, and that improves your score. It shows people who want to lend you money that you're not dependent on credit to pay off everything.
So in theory, over time, as your generation hangs on to those credit cards early on,
Yeah.
shows a good pattern over several years of paying credit cards on time, starts making more money, the credit limit goes up, all of that should even out. And in theory, the lower average score should start to climb.
Absolutely. The longer you deal with credit, the longer that you show, the more money you make, the longer you show that you are responsible with credit, you understand what credit is, the higher your score is going to become. So you'll go from the 630s into the 700s.
Okay.
And if you're thinking about getting a credit card, there's a lot of ways to do this. If you're still in school, there's a lot of good cards that are geared towards students who don't have an income. You have to be over 21 21 or over to get these cards, generally speaking. But we recommend the Discover It for students. There's a federal credit union out in the Northwest called with the First Card, which is a great card for people and students looking for good cards. And if you're out of school and you have no history with credit and you're applying for credit cards, you keep getting rejected and you're getting a little frustrated, one way to do it is go the secured credit card route. Basically, you put up some money as a collateral, and whereas a credit card without money away is unsecured, there's no collateral there. But if you put away, you give them some of your money, it shows them that you're good for it. You use up 20% of your credit limit every month. You pay your bills every month. Your credit score is builds, and after 6-9 months, you can get a better credit card.
Great. Let's turn a little to investing, and I'll take this one. In terms of another common myth about millennials is that you'll see this headline that says, and you'll see it, like if you Google it, you'll see it everywhere, that millennials invest like senior citizens. And it's part of a narrative that came out really after the financial crisis. So after the Great Depression, there was an entire generation of Americans who reined in their investing habits. They no longer trusted the stock market, and as a result, people were investing long-term money in things like cash or putting them into bonds or
under their
mattresses, literally under their mattresses. So the thinking was, if the Great Depression generation did this, then what would the Great Recession generation, those folks like you who came of age during this period, what would they do? And lo and behold, there came a survey or a set of surveys a few years back that said, you know what, after the Great Recession and the financial panic, that there are a lot of signs that your generation is acting in a similar way. MFS came up with an investor survey which got a lot of traction, which said that you all put more, in terms of your investment portfolio, not in terms of emergency funds or whatnot, but in terms of your investing portfolio, that the typical millennial holds about 26% in cash and only 30% in stocks. Whereas those who are 68 and older, so not just retirees, but really those who are really well into retirement, they were holding only 20% in cash and 40% in stocks. So that story was sent around the world, and everybody wrote versions of that. But it was based on a survey, and in surveys, people kind of give you a sense of what's in their portfolio without what's actually in it, without knowing what's actually in it. So if you look at the actual data of what's in individuals' retirement accounts, 401ks and other retirement accounts, that the Employee Benefit Research Institute, EBRI, had put out, and they keep a running tab of this, it would note that 20-somethings invest on average about 76% of their investment portfolio in equities, 30-somethings invest the exact same amount, and as you get older, as you hit the 40s and the 50s, that gradually goes down, as it ought to the 60s and the 50% range. So in theory, you guys are doing exactly what you ought to do. And this makes a lot of sense because when you think about it, your generation is more likely to use like a robo-advisory service than any other generation in this country. And those advisory services are based on standard algorithms that tell you if you're young, you should be more aggressive in stocks. If you're older, you should be less aggressive in stocks. Your generation is also twice as more likely to use target date retirement funds if you're in your 401k or in another setting than any other generation in America. And target date funds, for those who don't know, are those all-in-one funds that do everything for you. They're on autopilot. So they invest in a mix of stocks, bonds, and cash. And when you're young, they may be 80 or 90% in stocks. As you get older, they might drop down gradually to 60 and 50, and then a minority stake in equities. So it stands to reason that if you guys use these things, if you're willing to use these things, you're more likely to be in equities at this stage of your life. So it raises a couple of questions. Well, one, should you be more in equities? And the answer is yes. You should be very aggressive when it comes to your asset allocation in terms of your weighting in equities. And the reason why, in fact, for 20-somethings, there's a great rationale for being 100% in stocks, that there's no reason for a 20-year-old to own bonds unless there is some life event that they expect at age 25, for instance, to come around. And the stake, you have to understand that the risk that equities pose is based on not just on the percentage you have in equities, but the actual dollar amount you have in equities. If you're a 20-something and you get your first job, and let's say the job pays as a round number $50,000, and let's say you put 10% of that away in a 401k, That means you have $5,000 in the market in year one. If a bear market strikes, you could lose half of that, but half of $5,000 is $2,500. It may be a big amount of money now, but over the course of your career, it's very little. If you're alternatively a 55-year-old who is more conservative and puts 50% of their money in equities and 50% in bonds, that may seem like a more of a kind of a chickens approach, but that 50% could be the equivalent of $500,000. So if a bear market strikes, you could be down $250,000 in your portfolio. So obviously, the risk of being 100% in stocks at 22 is significantly less than being 50% in stocks at 55. So you have to kind of weigh those things. The one thing I would note is that if you are young, the one area where you might want to think about investing like your grandparents is with dividends. I think over the course, right now, if you look at the typical kind of stock that is most widely held among millennials, it's going to be a list that includes Apple, Google, Facebook, Tesla, and maybe Berkshire Hathaway. And surprisingly, when you think of Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett's company, the only one of those stocks that offers a dividend is Apple right now. Over the course of time, dividends matter. They represent, if you reinvest those dividends into the underlying shares of those companies, the dividends actually represent about 43, 45% of your total performance over a long stretch of time. So if you're thinking about, I know a lot of these companies that young folks would be interested in don't pay dividends now, but over the course of time, dividends will matter. Let me switch gears one more time to another myth with regard to millennials, and that would be the myth that based on student loan debt and whatnot, that college is not a kind of a good choice, or was not a good choice for a lot of millennials. Kerri Ann, can you give us a sense of what the student loan situation is and what that means for their personal finances?
Okay, so you guys aren't imagining it. Student debt is real. It's worse than ever. It's gotten way worse for us than students even in 1994. Paul, maybe?
Yeah.
Ish.
But truth be told, I am still paying off my college loans.
Right, but it's just not that much.
It's not that much, but
Yeah.
I refinanced my college and graduate school debt into like a 25-year loan when I was
It's like a mortgage.
young. So the minute I'm done paying that off, I will be paying my kids' college bills.
Wow.
So
I'm going to be paying student loans when I'm paying my kids' college.
that's right. Sorry about that.
Right, poor decision making. Go to the really expensive private school in New York, but all of you guys probably went to schools in Florida, which are relatively cheap compared to the rest of the country. So give yourself a pat on the back for making smart college decisions, unlike...
Go Knights.
I don't know how many... We have bright futures. I don't even know how much that gives anymore, but maybe some of you got some money from that program. I did. It was very helpful. But anyway, 2 decades ago, less than half of bachelor degree recipients graduated with student loans. Today, it's about 70%. And the amount of debt they carried just in the past decade has jumped from 19,000 in 2004 to now the average grad has about 30,000 in debt. That's not a small amount. It's really hard to pay that off, especially when you're starting out with a job that only pays you $30,000 a year. And if you go to grad school, it gets even worse for you. I mean, 15% of people with secondary degrees owe $100,000 or more. That really is like a second home, or like taking on a mortgage. Part of the reason why we're seeing that is that states are funding less education. Per student, state spending dropped 12% over the last decade. So we have to shoulder more of the burden, essentially. But that doesn't mean that college wasn't a worthwhile investment. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York did a study that found that on average, a bachelor degree is worth about $300,000. That's a lot. Basically, for 3/4 of people who take out college degrees, that degree really makes the difference. For instance, millennials with a college degree earn about $17,500 more than their peers with only a high school diploma. That pay gap was much smaller in previous generations. Having a degree didn't actually matter as much if you were in Gen X or if you were a boomer. That gap was much tighter. In our generation, that difference is massive. I mean, $18,000 a year is a massive gap. I mean, that could be like a semester's worth of tuition, depending on where you went. And college-educated millennials are also more likely to be employed full-time, and we're significantly less likely to be unemployed, 3.8% versus 12.2% for those with only a high school diploma. So it may seem daunting if you have student debt trying to pay that off, but in the long run, it was actually probably a wise decision. So if you're feeling doubtful.
What about in terms of what those who already have student debt can do to kind of chip away at it in an efficient way?
So I don't know how many of you have already graduated. But if you've already graduated, typically you'll be placed in a standard 10-year repayment plan. You'll have about 120 equal monthly payments. If you earn enough to pay off this in that period or less, do it. You will save so much money in the long run in terms of interest compared with other types of federal plans. If you have private loans, this isn't relevant, but if you have federal loans, if you can stick to that original payment plan they put you in, it will be hugely helpful in saving you money down the long run, unless you go into public service, in which you should apply for one of their other loan programs where you can get public service loan forgiveness. It depends on the plan that you're in, but typically after about 10 years, they will forgive your debt. So if you're considering going into any type of public service, it can be really worth it depending on how much debt you're carrying. If you're going to pay off that debt before 10 years, it's not really an incentive. If you're struggling to pay that off, the government has rolled out 5 new types of income-driven repayment plans, which means that the amount you pay each month is based on how much you earn. This can be a big lifesaver if you had like $800 a month student loan bill and you were only bringing home, $2,000. The revised pay-as-you-earn is probably the most generous, and it's available to the greatest number of people. So it's probably likely to be your best option. If you guys are struggling with repaying, I would look into that program first. And it has no income level qualifications, which means that almost anyone can enroll in this plan. And then another easy way that you can sometimes bring down your interest rate is to enroll in automatic payments. A lot of lenders will give you a small interest rate reduction if you automatically enroll with them in payments. The federal government, for example, will reduce your rate by 1/4%. I know that sounds small, but if you were taking 25 years to repay the loan, it can really add up. It can equal hundreds of dollars of savings over the life of the loan. And all you have to do is just automatically enroll. Although you want to make sure that you have enough money in there so that you don't default.
Yeah.
But.
And I refinanced at a time when interest rates were considerably higher than now.
Oh, that's fair.
So I locked in, I think, 7%.
I guess, but your
But
salary raises were a little bit
Yes,
higher.
that's right. Well, on that cheery note, we'd love, we have a bit of time. We'd love to take any questions if, on any subject that you want to ask us, except our own personal finances.
Paul, you seem to be willing to share.
That we haven't already disclosed.
Yeah, you guys have been a little more truthful. Just shout loudly.
Maybe you could. Do you want to shout?
You okay? Just come up to the stage and shout at us.
It's all right. Good deal.
Well, here's my question. My name's Frank. I'm from the University of North Florida in Jacksonville, Florida.
There it is.
Oh, that's good. Okay, perfect. So, back to the number of credit cards. You guys said it was a good thing to have a higher number of credit cards. However,
You might want to qualify that.
It's okay.
Having
No, sorry, go
higher
ahead.
number of credit cards is also meaning a higher number of inquiries. So which one is the lesser of two evils, using 90% of your credit or having so many inquiries over a short amount of time?
Using 90% of your credit is the greater evil. Yeah, like you don't want to go. you don't want to go crazy, and I'm not advocating having having more credit cards than you can deal with or understand or want to deal with, because it's like an intellectual thing you have to deal with. You may not want to even worry about it. In which case, if you want to have 2 cards or 1 card and keep your spending to 20%, that's great. The inquiries, it's a temporary ding on your credit, but it recovers over the next 2-3 months. And that's actually one good little hack. Is if you want to apply for a number of what a lot of people who are sort of travel mile freaks will do is they'll apply to a bunch of credit cards at the same time, so the inquiries happen at the same time, and that way they'll get a lot of these crazy reward bonuses. But don't even worry about that. The inquiry itself is not particularly, it's a temporary ding on your credit, it recovers over time, and it's not something that you really need to concern yourself with. It's much less important than using 20 to 25% of your credit and paying your bill every month. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chase. I definitely have a lot of thoughts on this whole topic in general, but I'm just going to speak on a couple of them. So for one, we talked about credit cards and we talked about the value of them, and at times I find that there is a value, but I feel like there's definitely more of a hindrance with those, considering the people that are getting them. You generally get a credit card not to always raise your credit score, but to also, because you can't pay for everything, and I feel like at that point you're not going to be able to pay off all your credit card balance, and it ends up hitting you harder than it's actually bettering you.
Can I answer that question before
Sure.
you go on? So that's absolutely true. The reason some people have credit cards is so that they can finance things that they can't otherwise finance. If you're looking, if your only options are, let's say you need a loan, and that's kind of what a credit card is, and you look at your APR, your interest rate that you're going to have to pay on your credit card debt, and that's pretty high. One option is to go for a personal loan, which will probably give you a lower interest rate. But there are cards out there that are specifically designed to help people who need to finance a large purchase. So the City Simplicity, it's 0% interest for 21 months, which means if you need to make a series of purchases that you need time to pay off, that gives you 21 months to pay off that debt interest-free. So you can break that into 21 months. The Chase Slate, if you need to transfer your credit card, let's say you have a credit card with a high balance that's with the interest rate's already kicking in and it's sort of killing your money, you can transfer some of that debt to the Chase Slate. You can do that for free without a penalty if you do it within 2 months, and then you have 15 months to pay off your debt. So I completely agree with you that a lot of people use credit cards as a way to finance things they can't otherwise afford. But if you go into debt with a plan, there's a good way you can do it without really hurting yourself as much. Anyway, sorry.
And I would say probably my second question is, why is it important to go into debt?
I'm not saying.
I'm not saying just with that, but it seems that
You're talking about the concept of using a credit card as the idea of taking on debt.
exactly. Why is it important to have a
It's
credit
not
score?
a good idea to go
Yeah,
into
he's
debt.
not saying go into debt. He's saying use the credit card as you would your debit card,
Right.
pay it off.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're not in debt, but you've showed that you've used the card responsibly without racking up any long-standing balances.
Right.
I think it is a little scary for people our age, we're already in so much student loan debt, to have this idea of like, if I use this card, I could be potentially taking on even more debt at like a scary 18% interest rate. I actually didn't get my first card until 25. Taylor yelled at me for many years, but I ignored him. But because I was kind of in a mindset too. I have a debit card, why do I need this other thing that could potentially get me in trouble? I could potentially, spend too much money on. It was a little scary. There was, a younger guy in our staff who thought the same thing. But really, I link mine to my checking account, so it really acts as like a debit card for me. And I am very careful, like Taylor said, to monitor what I put on it, and I only put a couple things each month. And I really check myself. And when it's done that way, it becomes less scary. It becomes less of this idea of even more crushing debt on you. Because I feel that hesitation, and I definitely had that, and I know other people who have had that. I don't know if that addresses your question.
I guess my real question was, because I have a credit card myself, and I do pay it off every 2 weeks just because I get percentage
That's
back
good.
and very smart with it. But it seems that I feel that this world is so accustomed to needing a credit score. And, we are depending on what that means. And we're basing our value on these numbers that are set by the credit card companies, whether it be to get a home loan, car loans, when we could just be living within our means and buying what we can actually afford. So why are we depending on this number that is set by?
Well, because most people can't afford to put $300,000 down on a house. Like, if you want to, if you want to have it, I agree with you, and there are being more. There are pushes in the credit space to sort of open up and sort of reevaluate how credit scores are formed and define better ways to do it. They took away medical debt as a detriment to your credit score recently, or they're in the process of doing that.
There have been talks about adding rent and utility payments to up your score, which they don't factor in now. So they are having conversations about how to reevaluate someone's credit worthiness outside of what has traditionally been the parameters.
But yeah, in an ideal world, you wouldn't need to borrow money to buy a house, or you wouldn't need to borrow money to pay off the roof on that house that you had to fix. But that's just not a reality for a lot of people.
Right. I know that there are ways to purchase a house without credit, without needing an actual credit score, with showing your worth through the accounts that you have.
That's very rare.
Yeah.
You would be hard pressed to find that many in many markets, that option in many markets, especially if you're dealing with a home that's not like a starter home. If you're talking about anything that's more than a couple $100,000, that would be very hard to do in this financial climate.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Daniela Bailey from IRC Fort Pierce.
There's a large group.
From where?
Alrighty, and my question is, so when you guys were talking earlier, you said to use 20 to 25% of your credit limit.
Wow, credit.
What if you use more than that but pay it off monthly? Can that build your score more, or it doesn't have?
They're gonna come after you. No, no. It's all a balance. There's never if you do this, then this will definitely happen. It all depends on a multitude of factors that go into your particular borrowing habits. And if you pay off your credit score, if you pay off a credit card, that's really good. But a large portion, like a third of the portion of your credit score, shows that you won't be able to. That sort of determines how you deal with your credit score. And if you are constantly using that high a percentage of your credit limit, it will adversely affect your credit score.
So it's down instead of going up.
Yeah, if you use up 100, if you max out your credit card every month and you pay off your credit card every month, that is worse for your credit score than using 20% of that credit limit and paying it off every month.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Brianne
Afternoon.
Davies, and I'm at Indian River State College. More of us.
I cannot hear anyone.
Wondering what is a good percentage of our income that we should use to put back to invest?
How much income to put back into
Yeah,
investing?
there are a lot of general kind of broad rules of thumb. I think people use round numbers, and 10% has been kind of a nice starting point because it's a number that comes close to getting you to a long-term goal without necessarily being seen as an undue burden. I think if you ask financial planners what's the real number is probably closer to 15%, especially if you get a late start. But if you get an early start, if you're starting in your early 20s or mid-20s, and you're able to come close to putting 10% in, you ought to be in decent shape.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That answers my question.
Hi, my name is Gus. I'm also from the University of Central Florida. I got my finance degree at the University of Central Florida, but I'm also interested in the journalism route. What steps would you take to go from understanding finance to the more journalism route? Would you just do it on your own, or do you think it's worth going back to school to get some undergrad degree in journalism?
Oh wow, this was an unexpected question.
Does that mirror your path a little bit in the sense of going to UCF?
I was an English lit major at UCF, and then I went to grad school at Columbia. I would say that if you have no journalism background, like if you haven't taken any type of internship or done anything, grad school can be a huge help in getting kind of your feet wet and getting an understanding of the basics. But if you're still at UCF, you can probably take a few basic courses or pick up the minor and take a few courses and just do internships. And that, if you want to go into finance with your background, you can use that and kind of wiggle in, because I feel like the journalism background is more common than the finance in terms of reporting.
Yeah.
You went back specifically.
Yeah, I mean, so there are like the grad school I went to, the City University of New York, is I think the only public journalism grad school in the Northeast. So that was a great avenue for me. But yeah, like there's no like science. You just gotta like hunt people down, like read a lot of stuff, hunt down the editors who edited them, send them emails with story ideas that look interesting to the type of coverage that they report on. Start building networks. The great thing about graduate school is that you can really build a network pretty quickly. So you have a lot of people going to bat for you. So if you can find a network where you are now to help go to bat for you, whether it's auditing some journalism classes, or interning at the Sentinel or wherever, just start doing it.
All right, thank you.
You can come see me. I have some contacts still, so.
Hi, my name is Sadie, and I'm from Indian River State College. My question is on the topic of saving. I've been working since I was 16, 17, and I've always sort of been an extra source of financial support for my family. And I was wondering, what would you recommend for saving when you're in a situation that's not really conducive to setting money aside?
So you're saying that at the end of the month you feel like you have nothing that you can put aside?
Yeah, every time I get something saved that's worth talking about, something comes up and I have to put it towards the family or something like that.
It's one of the parts where if you're in a job where there is something like a 401, that can be a huge help because it's automatically taken out and you never see it. And you can set that with small amounts. You can automatically take, $50 or $100 out of your paycheck and put it in a savings account so you never see it. I do understand, though, that if you have family demands, it can be hard because they're constantly looking at you to tap those savings. It is really hard to try and free up cash if every dollar is already accounted for. That's why we talk about, like, if you're getting a tax refund, you can put that money aside. Is this where you want to talk about anything with Roths? Or?
Well, I mean,
it's hard finding money.
Yeah, it is hard. I mean, it kind of depends on how much wiggle room you really have, and only you know that. In the sense that if you're going to be in a situation where you know that if you put 5% or 3% away in like a Roth IRA, and you lock that down, that you're going to need to tap it, then there are going to be some issues with regard to tapping money that's in a tax. So if that's you, then I think that the issue really is the first step isn't necessarily working on how much you can put into an account, but working on your budget so you can get some kind of regularity on a month-to-month basis about how much you theoretically could put away. Because the last thing you want to do is put money aside for the long term and every year or two crack into that, because there are going to be penalties. Even if it's in a CD, a long-term CD, there are going to be penalties with that kind of thing. So I think it's really more an assessment of your own budget.
One hack that I like that I haven't tried, but it sounds fun to me, and as fun as personal finance gets, is like save every $5 bill. Like every time you see a $5 bill, that's sort of something you'll see on the internet a lot.
Did have someone tell us that she saved $36,000.
Yeah, someone claims they saved that much money. I don't really know, but like little things like that, where if you just take it and put it away, that's like a very tangible, small way to start thinking about and getting into the habit of automatic savings.
We also recommend, because you often hear, like, don't buy the $4 latte, don't buy the dress, and like cutting out everything that makes your life fun is horrible. But if you focus on kind of bigger items, which is housing, again, we don't know your personal situation, and maybe you've already cut all the expenses possible there, but living in kind of maybe not as nice an area that's cheaper, or taking on that extra roommate even though you don't want to, because that's like In
lot
New
of
York,
money.
it's like 50% of my budget. But here, hopefully you guys are being more financially responsible and it's far less of your budget. But that's kind of the biggest thing we spend money on, that, utilities, and food. But you're not going to eat less, and you're not going to need electricity less, so.
Right. Candles.
No, that's not sound advice.
That's too-
Candles are like $20 a piece.
That's true.
All right. Well, I am a server, so I might have to try the $5 thing. But thank you. You answered my question perfectly.
Thank you.
Thank
No,
you.
we know, it's hard.
Thank you.